She was not the first wife to bleed in silence, nor the last to pray in vain, but she was the one who lingered, while the others were silenced by steel. Catherine Parr was devoured by the silence itself. Her death did not arrive with a blade, but with a whisper, a slow unthreading, one stitch at a time, until breath itself forgot her name. There is something unholy about a queen who survives too long. She becomes an echo in her own chambers, a relic mistaken for power, a breathing ghost, and Catherine Clever, composed, too patient for the blood-soaked dance of Tudor desire, was a woman sharpened by restraint. She watched as crowns fell and gowns soaked through. She held the hand of a man whose lips had blessed the block more often than the Bible, and still she stayed. But mercy is never gifted to those who endure. The ones who linger are always devoured in softer ways. There was rot in her womb before there was rot in her grave. Something unseen, sacred, and doomed. The kind of decay that begins while the skin is still warm. Her final child was not born. It was torn, not wept for, but warned against, as if the heavens themselves refused to let her legacy breathe. She was the last wife, but not the last curse. The ghosts she inherited had names: Anne, Catherine, Jane. Their sighs clung to her bodice, their prayers laced into the latches of her chamber door. She tried to outlive them. She tried to be holy, learned, untouched by sin or courtly filth. But holiness in that court was a kind of madness, a mirror that only showed you what you would lose. There is no image of her final breath. No painter dared render it. No choir sang. No sword gleamed. Just a bed that grew colder as dawn broke, and a scream that never left her mouth. In the end, her death was not horrible because it was loud, but because it was quiet, unnoticed, as if the kingdom had already buried her before the fever claimed her. She was not beheaded. She was erased. She had the bearing of restraint carved into her bones, as if the angels who formed her had used silence instead of stone. Catherine Parr, the last wife of a king rotting from within, moved like a woman rehearsing her own disappearance. There was no room for excess in her eyes, no indulgence in her breath, only calculation wrapped in patience. Like a prayer forced to kneel too long, she was born into a world of chambers and corridors, of whispers behind drapery, of poison stirred gently into rose water. She had read the scriptures that no woman should read, held the thoughts that no queen should speak, and still she learned how to smile in stillness while the ground shifted beneath her. The Tudor court was a theater of blood, and she, the final act in a tragedy already soaked through with death, was expected to bow before the curtain fell. Yet she did not bow. She wrote, she reasoned, she waited. And in waiting, she became something the court could neither crown nor crush. Her presence did not provoke fear, but unease, the kind that comes when a candle refuses to flicker in a room full of shadows. She was not like the others, not like Anne, whose fire scorched too bright, too fast. Not like Jane, whose meekness was mistaken for safety until she bled a son into the dust. Catherine was composed a polished blade sheathed in velvet, a widow who refused to wail. She had survived the chambers of death twice before she entered Henry's. 2 husbands had died with her name still warm on their lips, but neither had dragged her soul into darkness. She emerged each time with the dignity of ash transformed, not destroyed. And then came the king, Henry V, swollen with decay, swollen with ghosts, a man whose breath stank of wine and old prayers, who wore guilt like fur upon his shoulders. He had killed for sons, silenced for power, and crowned queens with the same hand that pointed them to death. When he took Catherine Parr into his realm, it was not for love, but for need, a nursemaid to his sins, a balm for his rancid pride. Her intellect was both a blessing and a threat. She soothed his mind with the language of scripture, but the court saw danger in her tongue. Women were not meant to speak with such clarity. Women were not meant to publish. Yet Catherine did, in secret. She wrote what others feared to whisper. Her words were careful daggers, cloaked in devotion. She prayed with ink, and her pages bled questions. Is salvation found in obedience or in understanding? Can a woman interpret the divine and still remain silent? These were not questions fit for queens. But Catherine had long learned that obedience is not always submission. Sometimes it is camouflage. She wore the veil of the devout, but beneath it pulsed the rhythm of revolt. Her chambers were lined with books, not silk, psalms bound in leather, reformist treatises smuggled in from the continent, annotations written in a delicate hand, trembling with urgency. She read by candlelight when others slept, and the flame cast shadows across her face like a prophecy. To the courtiers, she seemed too still, too learned, too absent from gossip and too present in thought. They could not hear the rustle of her intellect, so they feared its silence. Behind her, the air grew colder. Around her, the walls listened, and yet she endured. In banquets, she wore jewels like armor. At court, she nodded with the grace of someone measuring every breath for danger. The women around her curtsied with downcast eyes. The men watched her mouth without hearing her voice. Even the tapestries seemed to hush when she passed. She had become a ghost before death, and in that spectral state, she survived. But what is survival in a court built on endings? The air in Whitehall smelled of wet stone and fading roses. The corridors were too long, the ceilings too high, the doors too thick. They swallowed secrets like hungry beasts. Catherine wandered them with footsteps so soft even her own past seemed to lose track of her. The Queen's presence at court was ceremonial, but her absence from drama was unnatural. The others had screamed, schemed, seduced. Catherine remained still, and the stillness disturbed them. Power, after all, was not meant to be silent. Her power was restraint. Her seduction was intellect. Her sin was to outlive, and in a kingdom where queens were expected to inspire madness or mourning, Catherine inspired neither, only unease. Henry trusted her body but feared her mind. He held her close like a relic and kept his distance like a sinner before an altar. Their marriage was not of passion but decay. He was rotting, and she was preserving. She touched him with the gentleness one gives to wounds, not lovers. She prayed beside his bed as if guarding a tomb that still breathed. In the court beyond their chambers, eyes watched with venom. The old guard, loyal to the Pope, detested her reformist leanings. They whispered of her books, her letters, her prayers that did not match the crown's doctrine. Some said she would lead the king into heresy. Others said she was already leading herself to ruin. But Catherine heard their whispers and turned the page. She knew that survival was not in silence, but in timing. She would speak when the candle burned low, when the hall fell still, when the ink could dry without notice. She had mastered the art of disappearing while still standing in the room. Yet no mastery could shield her from the tide beneath the surface. There was a heaviness in the palace that summer. The king's health worsened, his legs festered, his temper curdled. The smell of rot followed him like incense. Catherine ministered to him with the detachment of duty, but each night she returned to her own bed hollowed. The scripture no longer sang. The candle no longer warmed. Her dreams grew darker. Blood on nursery linens. Screams echoing down corridors she had never walked. A child's breath stilled in the cradle. She began to speak less. She began to eat less. Even the ink on her quill seemed reluctant. She had married power and nursed decay, and now her own body betrayed her. When she conceived, it was not with joy, but with dread. The child moved inside her like a secret too dangerous to confess. She felt it as judgment, not miracle, a last offering to a king already shadowed by death. Catherine withdrew from court as her belly grew. The courtiers whispered that it was age, or illness, or piety. But the truth was simpler. She was preparing to vanish. She wrote her final work, Lamentation of a Sinner, as if knowing it would be her last confession. The words were tender, but beneath them, a storm. She repented not only for sins, but for silence, for endurance, for bearing witness to too much and changing too little. Her heart had become a reliquary filled with bones, not hope. She sent her letters with care, sealing them with prayers and tears. Her friends read them with trembling hands, uncertain if they were blessings or farewells. When the time came, she left London. The child would be born in the quiet, away from court, away from judgment. She retreated to Sudeley Castle, a place of damp halls and endless silence. The air was thick with rain, and the rooms whispered with draughts. The walls did not echo, they swallowed. Catherine paced them like a penitent ghost, hands trembling on her swollen belly. The servants avoided her eyes. The midwives crossed themselves when they entered. Something hung in the air that was neither fear nor reverence, something colder, something final. In the damp corridors of Sudeley, where the stones sweated secrets and the wind wept through unlatched windows, the betrayal that undid Catherine Parr did not arrive with a blade, but with a kiss. It came in the form of Thomas Seymour, brother to a dead queen, uncle to a frail boy king, a man whose charm reeked of hunger more than affection. He had watched Catherine from the shadows of the court long before Henry's corpse cooled, and when the king's heart ceased to beat, Seymour crept into the queen's grief like a shadow slipping under a locked door. Their marriage, quick and unblessed, unfolded under the guise of passion. Yet Catherine's lips trembled each time they met his, for he was not a lover. He was an echo of ambition. His hands reached for her body, but touched only her title. Her crown had been buried with her husband, but the scent of power still lingered on her skin. And Seymour, half wolf and half widower, fed on that scent like it was the last feast of a dying court. Catherine knew this hunger. She had seen it before in the halls of Whitehall, in the gazes of courtiers, in the eyes of her husband when he looked at thrones more than at wives. And yet, she let Seymour in. Perhaps she was tired of surviving. Perhaps she mistook the heat of danger for the warmth of love. Perhaps she thought she could save him. Or perhaps she already knew no salvation was coming, and this final betrayal would serve as the shape of her own quiet ruin. The court watched their union with disgust, thinly veiled by etiquette. Elizabeth, the girl princess who lived under Catherine's roof, saw more than she was meant to see. Her eyes, sharp with youth and already shaped by the ghosts of women who died too soon, noticed the way Seymour's hand lingered on Catherine's waist, then strayed when the queen turned her back. It was said he crept into Elizabeth's bedchamber early, under the veil of playfulness, that he tickled her sides while she writhed with adolescent discomfort, that he cut her dress while Catherine looked away, laughing but dying inside. And Catherine, Catherine knew. She knew the shape of evil when it arrived in handsome form, when it spoke gently, when it smiled while placing hands where they should not belong. She had been married too many times not to know, yet she said nothing. Not because she approved, but because she had become too practiced in silence, too well versed in pretending peace when the hearth was already ash. The betrayal fermented slowly, not only of husband against wife, but of trust against self, of guardianship against innocence. And Catherine bore it all with the broken stillness of a woman who understood that some things cannot be saved without being destroyed. In the night, she would walk the halls alone, her feet bare on the cold stone, listening for the lies that slithered behind locked doors. The tapestries did not move, but she felt the walls breathe. She passed Elizabeth's chamber and paused, hand hovering over the latch, but never entered. What could she say that the world would feast on her silence if she spoke? That men like Seymour did not need swords to kill. That ruin comes first as charm, then as touch, then as accusation too late to matter. So she moved on, like a ghost walking the night of her own house, and the betrayal deepened. It was not only Seymour's hunger for a younger, untouched girl, it was his hunger for power, sharper than any seduction. He sought proximity to the boy king, to the throne, to the regency that had eluded him. He used Catherine's name as a shield, her home as a hunting ground. Each letter he wrote was dipped in honeyed ambition. Each ally he courted came with whispers of plots, of plans, of futures shaped by greed. And Catherine, now heavy with child, felt it all pressing in. The air in the castle thickened with secrets. Servants spoke in half sentences. Letters vanished. Rumors bled from room to room. Catherine's own body betrayed her, its swelling, its bleeding, its aching refusal to obey. The child inside kicked with a violence she had not known in her first womb, and she wondered if this too was a warning. She saw her reflection once in a rain-slicked window, her face pale, eyes hollow, hands trembling. Not a queen, not a wife, not even a mother yet, just a vessel surrounded by vultures. She wrote no letters that month. She prayed without voice, and in the dead of one night, as thunder clawed across the hills and the rain lashed the windows like a curse, she went into labor. It was not the labor of miracles. It was the labor of reckoning. The midwives whispered prayers while gripping linens soaked in blood. Catherine screamed once, then fell silent, her jaw clenched as though she refused to beg. The child arrived not with joy, but with horror. A daughter, silent, pale, breathing, but barely. They placed the infant in Catherine's arms, but she did not look. Her gaze remained fixed on the ceiling beams, as if waiting for something to fall or descend. Seymour was not there. He had gone riding that day, hunting something only he could name. When he returned, Catherine was already shivering, her body burning from within. Puerperal fever. They said childbed illness, the polite name for a death that stinks before it arrives. The betrayal was not just Seymour's. It was the betrayal of flesh, of motherhood turned grave, of a body that carried too much silence for too long and now split open to release it. In those final days, she did not weep. Her sheets were soaked in sweat and blood, and her breath rasped like parchment being torn. She spoke few words, but what she did say chilled the room. "If he comes," she whispered once, "do not let him near the child." The nurses nodded, eyes downcast. Catherine's fingers clawed the mattress not from pain, but from memory. She muttered names not present: Anne, Jane, Elizabeth. She asked for no priest. She called for no absolution. Her soul had been preparing for this moment long before the fever, and somewhere beyond her chamber, Seymour plotted still. He did not weep either. He paced the halls like a man whose fortune had twisted, not broken. Catherine was dying, and in that death he saw inconvenience more than tragedy. He sent letters to the council. He smiled in court. He calculated timelines. For men like him, even a wife's corpse could be useful so long as it was quiet. The betrayal did not end with Catherine's death. It grew fangs in the months that followed. Seymour, now widower and still untrusted, tried to gain access to the child. He failed. He tried to manipulate the boy king. He failed. He tried to seduce power itself. And power finally turned. Within a year, Seymour was arrested, charged with treason, and beheaded at dawn. But by then, Catherine's bones had already cooled in the chapel crypt at Sudeley. No bells tolled for her. No great mourning, no pageants of remembrance, just damp stone and autumn leaves, and the faint sound of wind brushing the stained glass windows above her tomb. The court had moved on. Elizabeth grew watchful. The child, named Mary, lived only 2 years, and Catherine Queen, reformer, mother, survivor, was remembered not for her life, but for how quietly she vanished beneath the weight of a betrayal that no one would name aloud. The fever did not roar, it crept, one bead of sweat at a time, soft as breath, slow as regret, blooming beneath her skin like a garden of rot. In the final days of Catherine Parr's unraveling, the world around her began to imitate the stillness of a tomb. The curtains were drawn, though the sun rarely pierced the gray sky. The scent of lavender failed to mask the reek of flesh in revolt. Her body, once the repository of silence, had turned on her with a cruel eloquence. Every inch a flame, every joint a crucifixion. She lay in her chamber at Sudeley, the walls pulsing with candlelight like veins, the ceiling heavy with the shadows of saints who did not answer. No royal physician dared confess what was already written into her sweat. She was dissolving from the inside, flesh forgetting its shape, spirit forgetting its tether. The child had been born, barely breathing. Her lips tinged blue like violets crushed beneath frost. And Catherine had looked at her only once, not with joy, not even sorrow, but with a gaze that knew the girl would carry nothing of her. No voice, no crown, no history, but absence. Her lips had moved, perhaps to bless, perhaps to beg, but no sound had come. Her voice, like her blood, had already begun to leave her. Those who tended her said she did not cry out in pain, only that she murmured names like confessions left too long in the throat. Jane, Anne, Henry, God. The names bled into one another until they were no longer names, just syllables echoing down a corridor between life and the place where even memory is exiled. Sometimes she reached for someone, though no one stood beside her. Once she whispered, "Is this what they felt?" And the midwife who heard it crossed herself 3 times and dared not answer, for Catherine knew what few did death. For Queen's was never an end, but an indictment. She was dying not in grandeur, not in ceremony, but in sheets soiled with betrayal and salt. Her bones ached with the weight of unspoken prayers. Her hands clenched only at the thought that she had survived too many deaths not to understand her own. And around her, the house began to mourn before she was gone. The servants stepped lightly. The midwives stared too long. Even the crows outside the window stopped cawing, as if waiting for the soul to slip from her lips before they broke the sky open with shrieks. When she finally stopped breathing, it was not with drama. There was no final gasp, no cry for redemption. Her chest simply stilled, like a curtain that stops swaying after the wind has left the room. The women in the chamber did not speak. They only watched as her skin cooled and her eyes stayed open. Not in fear, but in the quiet astonishment of release. It was only after an hour that one dared to close them. And even then, she did so gently, as if Catherine might wake and ask to finish her final sentence. The child was taken away. And the silence Catherine had cultivated all her life settled upon the room like dust, thick and suffocating. No trumpets marked her passing. No choirs sang her into heaven. She had been a queen, a reformer, a writer of sacred fire. But her death echoed with the hush of forgetting. Her coffin was carved in haste. Simple, unadorned. The funeral was swift. Rain slicked the stones as they lowered her into the crypt beneath Sudeley Castle, the scent of wet earth rising like a second body. Yet something of her remained, not her body, which decayed as all flesh does. Not her crown, which had passed into irrelevance, not even her child, who vanished into the hush of infancy, but her absence. Her absence grew louder than her life. The court, long trained to feast upon memory, could not digest her silence. She had left behind no scandals, no affairs, no great sin to anchor gossip, only questions, only pages. Her final book, Lamentation of a Sinner, remained a testament not to power, but to the agony of grace. It was not a queen's book, it was a mourner's. It spoke of suffering as something intimate, sacred, indivisible from love. But few read it. It was dangerous to read too closely what a dead queen had whispered. Words, after all, have teeth. Her theology unnerved the bishops, her intelligence unsettled the throne, and her memory became a kind of infection that had to be buried beneath polite hagiography. The new king, young and shivering beneath robes that did not fit, made no public statement. Elizabeth, haunted by her own brush with ruin beneath Catherine's roof, sealed her mourning behind a veil of brilliance and ambition. None dared speak what Catherine had almost been. None dared name the truths she carried to the grave, yet her legacy did not sleep. In the minds of women who read in secret, who prayed not for sons but for salvation, her voice flickered, not as dogma, but as defiance. She had written herself into eternity, not as a queen, but as a witness, and that frightened those who built their power on silence. The men who had feared her intellect now feared her ghost. They whispered that her death had been a punishment, a divine correction, but they dared not say it aloud, for they knew it was a lie. Her death was no punishment. It was a consequence of seeing too clearly, of surviving too many kings, of writing where she was meant to weep. And so she lingered, in ink, in whispers, in the memory of girls who would one day become queens, or nothing at all. Her tomb, tucked beneath cold stone and centuries of ivy, became a wound that the monarchy never named. Others would rise, others would reign, but none with her particular silence, none with her restrained fire, none with her gaze that could see the whole court burning and still choose to write instead of scream. And in the quiet corners of time, when historians searched for the softest tragedies, they found her there, half forgotten, half erased, fully present in the ache of things left unsaid. Catherine Parr, the final wife, not the bloodiest, not the loudest, just the last. And in being last, she became the echo that would never leave the chamber. Beneath the stone floor of Sudeley, her name lies without breath, without crown, without sound. A queen not slain by sword but by stillness, not condemned by decree but by the slow betrayal of a world that rewards obedience and punishes vision. Her death was not an event, it was an atmosphere. It crept like mist through corridors, settled like frost upon silk, and left behind a silence no anthem could dispel. The fire did not consume her, the noose did not tighten, no executioner raised a blade, and still she was extinguished, gently, completely, as if history itself had grown weary of watching women survive. There is no monument grand enough to hold the weight of what she saw, what she knew, what she chose not to speak. Her tomb remains, yes, chiseled and polished, draped in the polite lies of remembrance, but the true marker of her passing is invisible. It lives in the pages she left behind, in the half-burned letters, in the breathless hush that overtook a room each time her name was whispered. It lives in the questions that follow every woman who dares to endure too long in a kingdom built on ruin. So let them sing of kings and battles. Let them paint portraits of bloodied queens and heroic ends. Catherine Parr left them none of that. She gave them only a closed book, a fevered breath, and the shape of a woman vanishing without permission. She died not screaming, not fighting, but watching, waiting, unforgiven, unpunished. And when her eyes closed, the silence that followed was more terrifying than thunder. She was not remembered as a martyr. She was not mourned as a villain. She was simply gone. And perhaps that is the cruelest death of all, to be erased while still echoing.